It is exactly 5 after 8 o'clock. Welcome to the program on this beautiful Wednesday morning, the 16th of November, 2022. Now, we do know that our president was attending the G20 Leaders Summit in Bali, Indonesia, and it is at this forum that he's raised the issue, suggesting that the addition of the African Union will give a more unified approach to solving challenges currently plaguing the world. So let's unpack this in more detail. Is this going to make a beneficial difference to the continent of Africa joining this G20 leaders group? Uh, Nixon Katembo, Africa Affairs Analyst based in Johannesburg, is going to unpack this issue for us. Nixon, a very good morning to you. Welcome to the program.
Good morning to you and good morning to your listeners and viewers.
Lovely to have you on your show. Thank you for being with us. So, what do you make by that comment by President Cyril Ramaphosa? Number one, is it a possibility? Number two, will it bode well for the continent of Africa? Is there more to gain out of being part of the G20? Or is there going to be some form of trade off?
It's a very interesting request from our president, President Cyril Ramaphosa. And if you ask me whether it's going to be beneficial to the continent, the answer I think is no. This is because, in my view, the global financial architecture and the global political economy structures, if you want to look at them, coming from the Bretton Woods institutions, actually, of which much of the G20 countries are a member of, and they spearhead those institutions, namely the World Bank, the IMF, and so on. And you look at Africa has been to the world, and particularly to the G20, as just sort of a place where you can just get resources and that's it. The rest is just a mere facade of cooperation between Africa and those countries in the form of aid, rather than a transfer of skills and knowledge to develop the continent. That has not happened. So I don't think that joining the G20 as per request of President Cyril Ramaphosa of the African Union is going to hold waters. And first and foremost, who is in the African Union is going to join, because we have 54 countries. Of course, bearing in mind that Africa is a continent of plus minus 1.2 billion people. You have just outlined there that the world is now about 8 point something billion people. The Gini coefficients on the African continent vis-a-vis the targets, the economic target of the G20 countries, all that is not factored in when making all these requests for the African Union or the Africa to join the G20.
Brings a whole lot of other issues into play here, because once again it indicates that Ramaphosa is the eternal diplomat. Wherever he goes, he kind of says the right things, and he tries to obviously he plays this persona of his, the gentleman and the diplomat, and being friends with all of the different leaders that he comes into contact with. So let's look at it realistically. Let's look at it pragmatically. Does this involve becoming a member of the G20, becoming part of the G20? He's suggesting the AU, and the majority of the countries in Africa are part of the AU. Are there any monies involved in becoming members? The other important issue you raise is, normally when African countries do go to all of these different summits, etc., it is really about aid that is much needed on our continent. And with that in mind, would they be willing to have Africa become a member of the G20? And my third and important question is, when I spoke about the head of the AU, That too is a very contentious issue, is it not? Because it's being headed by a Moroccan leader. And we know that there's deep division in Morocco regarding this, the Sahel region, and Morocco being seen as being very discriminatory to the people of the Sahel, who are supposedly the rightful people of Morocco. And the Moroccan leader heading up the AU doesn't sit well with a lot of leaders, not only in Africa, but the Western world as well. So, with that in mind, do we have a hope at all of being on this G20 leaders group?
Well, you said about the diplomacy that President Cyril Ramaphosa kind of take in terms of approaching world affairs. But if you look at the composition of the African Union, as you said, first and foremost, let's look at its funding. Much of it is funded by Europe and China. The United States, on the other hand, is pulling the string in terms of its own interest. Now, the questions you brought up with the Moroccan leading that particular union, you will know for the fact that Morocco got out of the AU in 1975, if not 76, over the issues of Western Sahara. And our country here just hosted the Sahrawi Republic president in recognition of Western Sahara as a country, some of which Morocco does not recognize. So we have these internal divisions and contradictions within the African Union, particularly to its funding, its position vis-a-vis world political economic issues and geostrategic issues for certain countries, and including mostly those G20 members, namely the main ones such as France, the United States, the UK, Canada, and so on. Each of those countries have a particular interest. And then, interestingly for Africa, there has been a tendency for countries within Africa, individual countries, discussing with these G20 members or in their own term, negotiating their own trade deals. The question is, if we join the African, the G20, the African Union, who will spearhead the diplomacy in terms of various interests on the part of those G20 countries? That is remain unanswered. We are good at talking as Africans, and particularly with our leadership. But when it comes to analyzing critical factors that lead to those negotiations, be it in trade, be it in world politics, be it in the security architecture of the world, we find lacking. And unfortunately for Africa, we become still a source of resources, natural resources, for the development of those G20 countries and many other parts of the world.
And obviously, as you say, it's about the natural resources of Africa. We can't go to the table empty handed. If we, as the African continent, want to be part of this G20 leaders group, we have to bring something to the table. So the trade off is going to be our natural resources, undoubtedly. It's all about horse trading, is it not? That being said, being part of BRICS, well, South Africa being part of BRICS, how does that impact on being part of the G20 leaders group? And then you also mentioned China a little earlier on. China has a huge footprint in Africa. And I kind of wonder what's in it for China. Is it a fair trade-off? Is it a fair trade-off, knowing that obviously China comes in with their skills, their expertise, their support, etc., but they are getting a lot in return. They're getting a lot of our natural resources. So could you respond to all of those questions that I've put to you now?
Certainly, with the China is a very interesting case, because One, China has no history of colonization in this continent. But China also have outsmarted many other G20 countries who have a history of colonization or a history of imposing or changing governments on the African continent. Therefore, many African countries see China as a worthy partner in terms of their own ambitious development when it comes, for example, to infrastructure and so on. That is one aspect. But you talk about BRICS. There is a concerted effort, if you look at it from the world geopolitical affairs, in a shift in how the world economics is working, namely the contestation between China and the US, both being the first and the second world economy, respectively. And that has been quietly, frankly, exposed by the war in Ukraine, with Russia being also part of BRICS. So Africa has taken a stance to say that we are not going to condemn Russia. We are going to look at finding solution. But remember, the G20 summit that happened in Indonesia happened at a time when the Russian president is not in that particular meeting, but represented by Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister. Africa has President Ramaphosa and President Paul Kagame has been there, but both have a different thought about what need to be done on the continent. But looking at also the alliances, one have to take in mind on a different economic policies within these countries, particularly, for example, here in South Africa, where we seem to be as a pro-business, and the business of which much of the companies that come from the West not necessarily benefiting the local population per se. And this has been the story of Africa, even with natural resources. So really, the question of joining G20 for the African Union is neither here or there. The one who want to ask what economic mechanism as a continent, the economic policies have we put in place that going to the G20 will go with a coherent policy that seeks to advance the interests of the continent economically and politically, and also in terms of security, because economics cannot function with the security architecture with the continent facing so many conflicts. But at the same time, political stability is driven by also economic stability, and economic stability is driven by political stability. So
They're interdependent. They're totally interdependent.
Yeah, so those are the issues that really one need to look at to say, okay, hang on, we are joining the G20, but what do we have for ourselves, as you said, bringing on the table? Mineral resources cannot be just a carrot that we dangle for the West to join the G20. We have to have robust economic policies that seek to enhance the development on the continent, and therefore with that we can use it as our leverage going forward and joining the family of these G20 countries.
And that's where we leave it. So it's, as you have said, neither here nor there. Currently, it's not going to serve us as the continent of Africa. And perhaps it's just Cyril Ramaphosa once again being the eternal diplomat. Thank you indeed for your time. Enjoy talking with you. Nixon Katembo, Africa Affairs Analyst based in Johannesburg. Go well and God bless.
Thanks for having me.
It is exactly 19 after 8 o'clock. Standby. We're going to go to the markets, and thereafter we're going to be joined by Nicole van Drill. We're going to weigh in on the reopening of the Imam Haroon murder inquest, which is happening currently at the Cape Town High Court.